structured in a way that can differential racial outcomes. All right, next one. I think you probably just used the arrow. There we go. We saw how much of the activism and the uproar concerns K-12 schools. 37 states that have introduced legislation trying to limit or restrict the teaching of what's become associated with critical race theory. 14 states have passed that. We can go on again, Angela. On the other hand, right, 17 states have actually passed policies that expand the teaching that would generally be associated with critical race theory. So there's a lot of back and forth. So it's not just all one way or the other. Right, Angela? We also saw that the dividing lines seem to be the following, right? To what extent does racism still exist in the United States? To how is racism manifested and where does its power lie? And how best to teach about it in a way that brings about the best outcomes socially and individually. Debates seem to fall along those lines. Next. We also saw that it seemed to be that both sides see this as one issue and a host of issues that kind of map out onto a progressive and conservative split. So therefore, it's being used as a political tool. In cases, many people are using labels as a way to kind of heat discussion up to get people on their side. And as a result, the situations become extremely polarized. We looked at a biblical analysis that says that as Christians, we need to be clear, right, that what's going on, the way that things are being handled, does not really seem to be the way that Christ would want them to be handled. And also that it makes sense that this seems to be focusing on education because education is such a critical component of people's formation and of where society goes. Okay, so let's look at intersectionality. Just as with critical race theory, intersectionality has formed part of this uproar. And I think it's fair to say that intersectionality and the uproar over it has been subsumed under the uproar of critical race theory. You don't hear as much about it now. Really CRT seems to be in the news. But a few years back, right, 3-4 years back, you can see that John MacArthur and others issued a statement on social justice and the gospel. Intersectionality is explicitly mentioned as one that is not consistent with biblical teaching. On the other side, in 2018, you had the publication of a book, Intersectional Theology, talking about how intersectionality is absolutely crucial, right, to create churches that are welcoming, that embrace differences, and that helps them to center themselves on social justice. Next, Angela, if you could. Thanks. Not going? There you go. All right, so what is intersectionality then? There's a uproar over it, as we've seen. So it goes back to about 1989 when the term was first coined. Kimberly Crenshaw, who also was one of the leading figures in critical race theory, to describe how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another and overlap, right, to produce particular forms and experiences of discrimination. However, even though Crenshaw coined this term in the 1980s, this is based on a concept that had been developed over many decades, as you can see, of thinking and struggle, especially by Black and Indigenous feminists and other women of color. Again, you can see the citations I have there. That's fine. So again, a lot of text on this slide. Forgive me, I just wanted to highlight some things. It was Crenshaw really focused in, as far as her analysis was concerned, on the plight of women of color, and especially immigrant women of color. Now, even before this, she had actually written about a suit that had been brought forward by, I believe it was 5 African-American women in a company, where kind of their Blackness as well as their gender as far as women seemed to come together to create particular difficulties for them in terms of both of those. And as you can see here, this particular analysis in 1991, where Crenshaw continued to kind of advance this theory and insight, is that forms of oppression are not just additive, right? So it's not one on top of the other. Rather, women of color and those who have several different minority characteristics at once actually experience different forms of racism than others do. All right, so in a sense, especially when we're talking about women, gender is always race, and race is always gender, meaning that you can't get away from any of these elements, right, in which oppression exists, right? These all exist at the same time, and of course exacerbate the situation of people who embody several of these elements at once. Now, if we go to the next slide, what we can see here, I think this is just an absolutely wonderful kind of representation of the various different kinds of vulnerabilities that are out there, given the way our society is traditionally operating, right? So you have gender, you have citizenship, skin color, formal education, ability, sexuality, neurodiversity. I can't read the ones down there, but housing, wealth, language. So when you think about these, right, all of these different categories are categories in which certain people, by virtue, in this case, of being closer to the center, so if you speak English, right, if you are wealthy, if you own property, if you're skinnier, et cetera, right, you tend to be either more socially accepted, have more power, have more ability to move without worrying about any kind of things happening to you, whether it be social program or whether it be lack of opportunities for you. I'll just give you a chance just to kind of absorb that a little bit. Really interesting, I think, visual representation on how this theory of intersectionality really does identify, right, areas in which people can be marginalized, oppressed, and put down. All right, we can go on. I didn't give you too much wait time. Sorry about that. All right, so what's being said against intersectionality? And then we'll look at what's being said for it, kind of why some people praise it, but what's being said against it. Well, one is, and again, remember, as we saw last week in critical race theory, these are not necessarily things that the theory of intersectionality actually says, but there are interpretations and what people perceive it to be, and they contribute to the uproar. So Ben Shapiro, I don't know if you're familiar with him, a very popular conservative commentator, says it's a form of identity politics in which the value of your opinion depends on how many victim groups you belong to. At the bottom of the totem pole is a person everybody loves to hate, the straight white male. In a sense, saying that what it does is it discriminates against white males. That it is a conspiracy of victimization. It puts a label on you. It tells you how oppressed you are. Again, the suggestion there is, because all of a sudden people are telling you you're oppressed, you have a woe is me attitude, and you go on from there, right? These are the things that are being said against it. All right, Angela? That it's a new religion, right? That in a sense that it kind of brainwashes people, that all speech must be filtered through this lens, right, of identity groups. And in order to really kind of be a part of understanding this, that you have to confess, you have to check your privilege. And obviously, for some of you, for some of us, we're thinking, well, yeah, you kind of should do that. But again, these are part of the criticisms, right? Mm-hmm. Next one. What's being said is that, and again, what I did here was just kind of compile a whole bunch of research I did to try to summarize it, that in wider venues, especially in the social media and conferences and college campuses, that those who are of a particular identity or identities have the final say in terms of things, right? So if you disagree with somebody who's talking about a particular identity or set of identities that they hold, if you disagree with the conclusions they're reaching or even the recommendations you're making, then automatically that disagreement is characterized as manifestation of white supremacy, sexual orientation supremacy, or other exercises of power. Disagreeing can be seen as a form of aggression and hate speech. And also what you do find, and I think this is a valid observation, is that all of these forms of oppression, right, since they intersect, if you look at where discussions are going on any one of these issues, right, it could be on sexuality, it could be on race, it could be on a number of other things, anything critical that is said, right, in terms of disagreeing with minority viewpoints is held against you when you try to go into another sphere. So somebody may be very supportive, say, of kind of the idea of structural racism, but they may, for example, not be supportive of, say, transgender women who used to be male and now are not characterized as female, participating in women's sports, for example, right? And so it creates a very complicated situation, right? All right, next hand. So what's being said for intersectionality, kind of on the positive side? Well, that it's really important to be aware that all forms of inequality can mutually reinforce each other. And if you tackle only one form of inequality, one manifestation of power, and you're not aware of the others, you can actually end up doing more harm than good sometimes, right? Also, that intersectionality as a concept is really useful for those that are trying to organize activist movements to try to do away with discrimination and oppression. Why? One of the main examples is given that white women, feminist women who are battling, right, for gender equality, sometimes forget, right, that Black women, for example, have a very different experience. And so if you're not aware kind of that intersectionality, that's not just being a woman, it's being a Black woman, and then you can add some other things to it, you're liable to miss some things. And, right, as a result of being a white woman, you may actually be falling into unaware, right, kind of reproduction of discrimination, right? So intersectionality helps you to be aware of things that perhaps you might not be taking into account. All right, Angela. Also, what's being said for it is that organizational policies and trainings, especially around sensitivity training, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Sorry, I really didn't catch the typos this morning when I was going over. I apologize. That it is crucial to be aware, as we just spoke about, of the privilege that one might have by virtue of the identity that society assigns to you or that you assign to yourself. And that it's also important to be aware, to be sensitive to how people of different identities both define themselves and what kind of respect you can pay to them by being aware of how they prefer to be addressed and of their particular situations, right? So without kind of that thought process, without that awareness, right, you may be offending somebody not being aware of it. So intersectionality helps you think through these things. All right, next. All right, so if we step back then from all of this complicated situation and the uproar around it, what seems to be going on here? And I would say that there are three things going on. There are factual disagreements, disagreement over facts. There are disagreements over the moral frameworks in which these are being debated, and there are strategic disagreements. Notice as we kind of go through them that generally things are framed as an either or, right? There's not really room for any kind of nuance, or even many times for, on I would say, quote unquote, both sides, for people to be able to agree in one area but disagree with another area, even with their own side or with others. So I would say when we're talking about these factual, moral, and strategic disagreements, right, one has to do, as we saw with critical race theory, is racism systemic and structural, or is it just something that exists in individuals? Another major question that comes up that has all these factual, moral, and even strategic aspects to it. Do culture and individual choices play a role in keeping people of color down? Right? So you have heard some people would argue, well, no, it's just that people of color have what's called a culture of poverty. If you look at kind of, there's a whole stream of analysis of that, and that keeps them down. Not necessarily blaming people for that, but blaming the culture. Is that true? Is it not true? Those disagreements are both factual, as well as to say they would have moral dimensions. Is people's gender identity fluid or fixed? Right? That's another major debate out there. Is people's sexual preference a moral choice or dictated by nature? Again, you can see the either or, right? There's no context to it. Things become polarized on one side or the other. Is the best way to engage discrimination by quote unquote discriminating against those with power? The affirmative action debate, right? Comes up. Does looking at things through the lens of identities reinforce the very divisions that you are trying to overcome? All right, we can keep going. Again, some last few of these factual, moral, and strategic disagreements. Does portraying people and identities as victims of power encourage those people to behave as such and dampen motivation? should the internal problems of hierarchy and discrimination inside the identity groups themselves be tackled? We talked about that example of women of different color. And then finally, are people actually traumatized by the way language is used in arguments when people disagree with them? Or is this just part of a necessary process of increasing maturity and capacity in dialogue? And so this is a little bit newer, where I think there's been kind of a start of an opposition movement to all of the trauma-informed arguments that are out there. What really is trauma? Are people really traumatized by this? To what degree are they traumatized by this? Another flashpoint in terms of factual, moral, and strategic disagreement. So I think all of this then becomes summarized in the uproar as far as to what extent then, given all of this, should provisions be made for viewpoints, usually minority viewpoints, and rights that have a significant effect in all areas in terms of society, decisions over education, decisions over other things, especially if many, could be the majority, but could be the majority as well, believe that those kinds of provisions are morally and strategically wrong. Right? So you have these debates over factual, moral, and strategic considerations along all of those different lines at once, which is why it's so complicated. One of the reasons it's so complicated. All right, we keep going. All right, so I just want to put down a few kind of aspects, I think, where Scripture helps us reflect on this as far as we can engage. But I'm going to retake these when we finish up with social justice, because I want to get through social justice as well and then open it up for your insights. I so enjoyed your insights and your wisdom last week, and looking forward to continue learning from you. All right, so these are the scriptures that came to mind, right? One is that scriptural mandate of count others more significant than yourselves, right? Let each of you look not only to his or her own interests, but also to the interests of others. I think that speaks a lot, right, into this in terms of, as Christians, the way that we need to be approaching this, right? It talks about humility, etc. At the same time, also scriptures about, as we talked about last week, what is truth? Truth is something that we see dimly, as Scripture tells us. How do we build up an awareness and a fuller and fuller awareness of what truth is? And Scripture does speak to truth, right? So Zechariah is interesting doing research for this. I hadn't noticed this passage before, but speak truth to one another, render in your gates judgments that are true, and make for peace. That's one translation. That's ESV. The NIV talks a little bit more about court, so it's interesting to see the way that these were translated. Ephesians, right, talks again about spiritual maturity, where then as a culmination, instead speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ, speaking in love, right? If we're to be humble, which means that even though we're convinced that truth is on our side, we're still to be humble, and we are to speak in love. That how you do that obviously can be difficult, but it's key. And then the whole area around judging, right? On the one hand, Jesus says, judge correctly. On the other hand, right, he says, do not judge, right? Or you yourself will be judged. And my interpretation of that, again, comes with, yes, of course, you are forming opinions, and you need to form good opinions. At the same time, you should not be judgmental, right? Again, coming back to speaking the truth in love. That's my interpretation. We can talk about that some more. I would love to hear what you think about that. All right, we can go forward. And finally, right, the last couple of reflections, love passage, right? You can have all the truth on your side, as this is saying. You can actually be right on, but if you're not doing and you're not engaging in love, noisy clong, gong, clanging cymbal, right? You are nothing. That's pretty strong, right? Pretty strong. And James, I love this. Quick to listen. Isn't that great? Quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. How different is that from what we see out there, right? All right, let's keep going. Okay, let's go to social justice. And I know this is a lot. I apologize, but we should probably have done 3 sessions instead of 2. But Angela, next slide, please. All right, so we're going to look then again at the uproar around social justice, the history of the term social justice, how social justice is defined today by those who would say they are adherents to it, what's being said for and against it, sociological analysis of the uproar, biblical analysis, and then conclusions on how to engage as Christians. Then we'll jump into discussion. All right, Angela. All right, so I would say that social justice is kind of the tent, right? That umbrella that draws together both critical race theory and intersectionality. But again, really today, critical race theory is more than used. Social justice used to be kind of the one that was foremost back about 3-4 years ago. That's why the statement on social justice had that in its title. Interesting fact that in that statement against social justice was actually never mentioned, but all of those other things, right, that kind of that people were upset about on the conservative side were kind of shoveled right under that definition. So you can see how it has served as a tent, especially for those who are critical of it, to gather together a lot of things that people don't like. All right, let's keep going. All right, what's the history of the term? So just a quick definition of justice, very simple one, right? I'll be speaking of justice as giving somebody what their due is. Now, what that is obviously is a matter of question, but it's intimately involved with the question of rights, right, of human rights, and obviously with what is fair. So what does somebody do? They do their rights in a way that is fair. And it brings up two questions, right? If we look at this kind of definition, who decides what's due to people and what rights they have? Generally, you have the legal side of things, right? The state and the courts decide what rights you have. But also you have the court of public opinion, right, which is just not based on legal aspects, it's based on the wider moral aspects and the way that you go about thinking about things. And so on what basis do you decide what people are due? Well, it's laws, moral expectations, and for Christians, it's obviously God's law. All right, let's keep going. So generally, if you look at philosophies of justice, right, there can be many ways that justice is categorized. This is one way that I find particularly helpful. You have distributive justice, which is how society and groups within society should allocate scarce resources. You have procedural justice, how society ensures access to opportunities. Restorative, right, has what do you do in the case that somebody has suffered a violation of their rights. Retributive, punishment, commutative, which is more has to do with contracts, right? And social justice tends to focus in on the first two, right? How should scarce resources be allocated, and how do you ensure equal access or access to opportunities for all? All right, we can keep going. So the actual term social justice was first started to be used around the 19th century. If you remember, at that point, there is a huge upheaval in society as the Industrial Revolution came about. A lot of people, especially in Europe, were kicked off the land. Here in the United States as well, there's all kinds of things around trade unions, right? As factories started coming into labor laws and things like that. But in Britain, especially, the poor laws were passed because people, again, were kind of thrown off the land in order to make way for all kinds of different things. The issue of charity versus justice started to come up, right? What does charity mean? And is charity actually charity, or is it simply just a way to hide that unjust things are going on? And in 1931, the Catholic Church calls for social justice in that particular papal encyclical. And that encyclical really was trying to make sense of what was going on with capitalism, socialism, and communism. What the Catholic Church take on that was, and kind of the conclusion where this was used, the term was used, as you can see there, by this law of social justice. So really kind of characterizing it as a law kind of coming from the Lord in a sense. One class, you can see kind of the class analysis, is forbidden to exclude the other from sharing in the benefits. Hence, the class of the wealthy violates this law no less, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So social justice really was viewed in terms of a little bit of the rich versus poor, and the way the rich, at least in the analysis of that particular pope, were kind of not allowing for equal access of opportunities or for distribution of resources that were fair. All right, and keep going. 1948, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights came out. By the way, Christians were very much involved with actually bringing this about. And you have in this Declaration of Human Rights two types of rights. As you in the United States, we generally don't pay attention to the second category. We focus more on these civil rights, freedom of speech, of assembly, religion, fair trial, and all that. But it had a whole category of rights that were called economic, social, and cultural rights. I don't know how many of you have heard of those, but you spend any time, say, in Latin America or in some other places, these economic, social, and cultural rights are very much at the forefront. So you actually have, according to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, a right to work. You have a right to education. You have a right to housing, to health, a right to rest and leisure, and a right to participation in cultural life, right? That's probably a definition of rights that many of us would say, I'm not so sure those are rights, but those were enshrined, right, in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which shows you how the concept of rights, which is much wider than we tend to perceive here in the United States. As you can see, it didn't mention anything about race, gender, and sexuality. Those were not the debates at the time, unfortunately, I would say. But the focus, nonetheless, right, is on freedom, on the resources needed to flourish, and the rights needed for both of those. The state obviously is supposed to be the guarantor of these, right? And then these other rights, race, gender, and sexuality, started to be added to those, right, as the debates continued, added to those in terms of the notion of social justice. All right. So where are we today? And again, you can go on the web, you can kind of do a quick search in terms of definitions of social justice. I just pulled off a few. They all pretty much are the same because they're really, and I'm talking about those that adhere to the concept of social justice that were promoted as something good. So you can see there, right? It's a political and philosophical theory that focuses on the concept of fairness, equal access to wealth, opportunities, and social privileges, the belief that everyone should be protected and treated fairly, right? The emphasis on human rights, and right, that often social justice does lead to efforts to redistribute wealth in order to provide opportunities for underprivileged groups, right? And this is seen as a good thing, right? I think it's a good thing as well. All right. So what is being said against social justice today? Well, on the one hand, right, that social justice, even though it used to be defined as this fight against unfair inequalities, so many people on the conservative will recognize that, right? And many people on the conservative side will also recognize the importance of redistribution in some areas. But now, quote unquote, in woke thought, this phrase alludes to the twofold practice of deconstructing white power and redistributing power to minorities. You can see how far away this definition is, right, from the definition of social justice as it sprung up. But this is what now is being defined as social justice by those on the quote unquote more conservative side. It refers to political actions taken to liberate those perceived to be oppressed identity groups. And in practice, this means on demand for abortion, socialism, forcing Christians to violate their sincerely held religious beliefs. So all of these things, again, right, that are being gathered under this tent of social justice that people don't like. Also, that social justice blames all evil on external systems of oppression rather than on human hearts. It sees all truth and reason in light of group identity, that it divides people into group identities, that it seeks to force behavior modifications through different tactics such as pressure and intimidation, speech codes, that it holds that one's meaning and purpose is defined by any one particular person, right? And making those who differ from that the oppressor, all right? And finally, there's a whole kind of debate out there between social justice versus biblical justice. I don't know if you've seen that or not, but some will say, yeah, social justice and biblical justice kind of desire the same end, right? The hungry be fed, et cetera, but the beliefs undergirding them are very different, right? And the beliefs undergirding social justice, which means a secular commitment to human rights and a commitment to upholding identities, are very different, right, from those in the gospel. This would be claimed against social justice. And you can see the last one again, that's kind of more on the political side, that social justice really kind of encourages big government rather than kind of a focus on individual entrepreneurship. Okay. All right, so what appears to be going on here? If we take a step back, right, and try to analyze it. Well, I think first and foremost, we're at the emotive level when it comes to justice, right? Both sides want to claim that they're on the side of justice. And so there's a big battle. That's why you see biblical justice as opposed to social justice having been put forward. So the battle is who gets to use that label justice, right, for your side. So given that, the battle is over the definition of what justice is. And that brings up the questions, what rights should be recognized? So one side wants to claim that their identities give them rights. right? And therefore demands that those rights be respected. And you can see some examples there. The other side denies those identities as being valid basis for rights, and therefore don't see those struggles as a matter of justice. I think that's really important to realize. So, for example, right, the argument on that side would be that trans people really are not the sex they claim to be, so they shouldn't be given access, and I used this before, to sports of the other sex. And if you follow the news, right, one of the big news here is about a swimmer who used to be male, is now a trans female, right, is breaking all kinds of records, right? Should that trans person be allowed to participate in that sport? That's just one example, all right? In terms of a biblical analysis, right, I think it's absolutely essential to say the Bible says oppression is real. You just can't get away from that. Right? Oppression is real. And actually, when Jesus preached his first sermon, he talked about, right, to set the oppressed free is one of the things that he came to do, a very important thing. Second is that I think the Bible, my interpretation of the Bible is that God's clearly set up a system to be enforced by the government to ensure equitable access to resources and opportunities. If you're familiar with the year of the Jubilee, all the property was to return to its original owners, the system that God had set up. Why? If you got yourself into trouble and your kids suffered as a result, you sold your property or you squandered it, with Jubilee, that meant that your kids had a chance, right, to then reclaim their property and make life on their own. Remember, we're talking about a land-based system where property was key to flourishing, right, to economic flourishing. We can talk more about that if you want. Okay, keep going. I think it's also clear that God's law is to be the foundation for legitimate rights. The problem is, right, depending on your interpretation of Scripture, you're going to differ on what you think those rights are and applying that to our current context. So as a result, I think from a biblical analysis, we all have to be very careful about swallowing everything that comes under the social justice label, and we have to be very careful about throwing out everything that comes under the social justice label. Right? We need to practice prayerful discernment on each topic on its own merits. And again, I love to quote this verse, 1 Thessalonians 5, right? Don't quench the spirit, don't treat prophecies with contempt, but test them all, hold on to what is good, and reject every kind of evil, right? That's a much more nuanced approach. I also think it's crucial to realize, again, this is my interpretation, that God speaks both through believers and non-believers alike. My son's name, one of my son's names is Josiah, and so I'm fairly familiar with that passage. But so Josiah died because he didn't listen to King Necho, right, who was not part of Israel, who said, God spoke to me, don't get in my way. God told me to go here. Josiah didn't listen and was killed as a result. But there are many other examples, right, of God speaking through non-believers as well as through believers. So, and this is pretty much what we concluded last week as well, and I just wanted to reemphasize it. What to do as Christ followers in the face of this uproar? I just can't get away from you need to engage with patience, with love and grace. And it's, again, as we talked about, when you get into these issues, it's almost certain, right, that you're going to face some blowback in some way, shape, or form. Right? We need to acknowledge and promote truth where it lies, right? Making the strongest case for the opposition. Right? That's the best way to build up your arguments, to check your arguments, if you build up and to honor the other side's arguments as well, right? Again, test everything and hold on to what is good. Give and receive grace in this process is absolutely crucial. Right? At the same time, right, holding fast to God's love and mandate for justice. How we do that is not always clear, but that has to be foremost in our minds. And not to be beholden to forms of identity, right, that overcome and compromise our identity as followers of Christ. I think that might be the last one. I'm sorry? Pray. Oh, thank you. Yes, how can we forget prayer? Absolutely, prayer is that much. There may be one more. I had, we had discussion. I did have some verses in one of the other versions I had about ways about going about it, but I think we'll stop there for now. So, sorry. All right, so let's open up for discussions, questions, observations, insights. Yes?
So I was thinking of an example that I saw on Twitter about the intersectionality.
Sectionality. Yeah.
That's a whole other different thing. Washington Post about how churches should stop streaming their services because people weren't returning back to church. And then a lot of handicapped or disabled or people pushed back against her on Twitter, saying you're forgetting about us. And instead of her saying, oh my gosh, I didn't take your group into account in my, kind of demanding everyone get back in the pews and turn off the streaming, she doubled down. So she could not receive the critique. And then it blew up into a whole thing. And I was thinking about how often we're myopic in our viewpoint, and when someone points out something where you're not paying attention to, whether it's a word we use or proposing something, that we double down in our rightness rather than receiving that and letting ourselves open up to trying to be more inclusive. And yeah, it was a whole big thing.
I think that's so insightful. I'm just going to repeat it for those on Zoom in case you didn't hear. An example was brought up of how a person was saying that churches should stop streaming their services, get everybody back in church. Sure, very well meaning, right, because of the fellowship involved. But somebody from the community of people with disabilities wrote and said, hey, you're forgetting about us. This actually has been really good for us. And the person, instead of saying, oh my goodness, yes, I'm sorry, I forgot about you, kind of doubled down on it and blew up. And I think that's where that verse, say, from Philippians comes, right? Along with the other ones, right? Putting others before yourself and what your desires are. And I would say that person meant well, right? Really wanted this fellowship, missed the fellowship. But as you say, I think you said myopic, again, seeing through the mirror dimly, and then perhaps not having kind of, and this is maybe a little bit too harsh, but just kind of the love for those who are expressing, hey, this has been really good for us. We're in a difficult situation. What kind of accommodation can we make so perhaps we can create something that's great for both of us? Great insight. Thank you so much.
And I think it's particularly hard when it's Christians doing it, because you would expect more from someone who's like an acclaimed Christian writer to have a better response.
And it is disappointing. The comment is that it happens between Christians, and you would hope that a Christian would have a different kind of response. I do have to say, unfortunately, right, the church is in the fallen world. I played a lot of basketball, and the worst league I ever played in was a Christian, was a church league. The most violent, and it breaks your heart, right? It really does break your heart. But I think that's why Christ talks about us as being yeast and salt in the world, right? If each one of us can make a commitment to give witness and testimony to this other way of doing things, I do think that will have impact. Katie talked this morning about hope, right? I mean, we are referred to as the hope of the world through Christ, right? So thanks so much for that. Yes?
We're looking at in a political environment where the culture war, the harnessing of grievance, especially white grievance, gets you into office, and that has poisoned the Christian community.
So the comment that the harnessing of white grievance for political purposes has poisoned the Christian community, I agree. I agree. There's no doubt that happens. I also think there are people who are trying to counteract that, and their voices tend to get drowned out. I'm with Katie. I'm very hopeful. If you look at the history of our nation, of other nations, I'm not saying that we're by any means on a progress towards improvement, but what you do see us going through phases of conflict and then conflict getting resolved. And I don't know how this conflict is going to get resolved, but I do think that there is, remember kind of quote unquote, the moral majority on the conservative side? I think there is a moral majority and a silent majority that is just fed up, right, with all of this going back and forth, but they don't know how to engage, because as soon as you enter into it, you are just crushed, right? You're canceled, to use words, but actually you're canceled on both sides. You receive threats now, including death threats. And I think people are just scared and intimidated to try to say many of them to say what they really feel, right? And so the loudest voices that are the ones that get the most attention. So again, I think that's where we as Christians need to be courageous. And even though, even if you feel called to do it on a comment on an article or on social media, or even just one-on-one conversations or in school board meetings, whatever it might be, I think if you approach this with grace, yes, you will be attacked, but there are many people who will take notice. And you can begin, I think, to build up trust that way. Perhaps I'm too hopeful. I don't think so. Right? And pray. Thank you. Other thoughts, questions, comments, disagreements? Yes.
I don't like comments on that question here, but I'll ask you a question first. I think probably the biggest problem we have in our country right now is the Church of Christ divided. We have the 27 states that are against teaching. That's more than half of our states against teaching critical race theory. And I've been up to a Christian apologetics with the legal nasty comment. Christ's body is divided, right? In America, is divided between what the truth really is. Like look at the difference between Eastern and liberty. Look at the comments of John MacArthur. I mean, what's the solution when Christ's body is divided in America? How can you bring these, what we think we hear, how can you bring this truth on a level playing field? And as I said last year,
Last
Sunday, teaching at Presbyterian University, we have students coming from all over the world and from all over the United States. One person said, "Well, we're teaching critical race in their elementary school." That's great, but not you go down south. 27 states are not teaching, and they're fighting against it. So how do we as believers, the struggle between Eastern University and Liberty, how are we going to bridge this gap? What would you say?
So I'm going to draw a little bit on a book that I was blessed to co-author that's called Advocating for Justice and Evangelical Vision for Transforming Systems and Structures. Not to publicize it, but I just wanted and mention it to let you know that I've tried to think hard and pray through these issues quite a bit. Right. So the comment was that the church is divided. How do we go about it? I think one of the things that we can all do as Christians is to hold each other accountable. That what Christ wants us to do is not win, and I'm saying not win in laws, not win in terms of the positions that we're advocating, but rather Christ is more interested in how we're engaging in putting forth what we believe. I think the main problem with Christians across the board is that because of fear, because of a sincerely held belief that truth is on their side, they want to win many times almost at all costs. And those costs are not the costs that Christ, I believe, is happy with. When we engage with any one of these issues, I firmly believe that Christ is more interested in how we engage than whether, in fact, we are winning or not. I think that if we can adopt that kind of mentality and then gently and lovingly try to hold other Christians accountable to that mentality, that holds a lot of promise. So if you see a statement like the presidents of the Southern Baptist seminaries that comes out against critical race theory, without a confession that starts with where you don't have a confession of the racism which we as white Christians have engaged in, right? And again, it's nuanced. I think as Christians, again, we're supposed to take the log out of our own eye first before we kind of accuse others. So let's follow that pattern, that biblical pattern. That sets a very different tone. Let's talk about how by saying that if you believe in social justice, you are not saved, right? How the Bible clearly says that as a Christian, you are not to judge other people's salvation, right? How do we lovingly try to hold each other accountable to the way we engage? right? Taking the focus off of whether we're winning or not. And that's tough because the world, and we all know we're committed to justice. We want what we truly believe to be justice to win, right? We truly want that. But again, we see through a mirror dimly, and the way we go about engaging that means that the ends do not justify the means of our point. Anyway, you can see I get a little worked up about this, right? So that would be what I would say to that. If we're not modeling, and if we're not trying to hold each other accountable as Christians in love to model what Jesus wants us to do as we engage, then I think we're going down the wrong path. Let's see if somebody on Zoom, does anybody on Zoom have any questions or comments, Angela? Yeah. All right. Other comments, questions, insights? Yeah.
Is it possible to go back on the slide?
Yes. I think, well, Angela, is it possible?
Look at it.
Or you all have the handouts. So you can just tell us. I'm sorry, they weren't numbered. I apologize.
Yeah, it's the slide, the title is History of Social Justice, and it's the slide that refers to the Catholic Church
Yeah.
and what was said in the Catholic Table.
Right. Yes.
As I was reading that, you highlighted in yellow first half of the statement, and I thought the second half of the statement was almost more important because
Thank you.
for me, it points to a larger issue, but I have a slide here, I can't read it.
I'm sorry about it. So I'm going to take my glasses off so I can read it. So this is about the slide in the history of the term social justice, referring to the papal encyclical in 1931. The comment is, it seems like the part that was not highlighted is actually more important for the first part. Thank you. So it says, by this law of social justice, one class is forbidden to exclude the other from sharing in the benefits. Hence, the class of the wealthy violates this law no less when, as if free from care on account of its wealth, it thinks it the right order of things for it to get everything and to work or nothing. The reason I highlighted that was because social justice was in there, but you're absolutely right. Yes, so please go ahead.
So that comment that the wealthy think that it's their right
To own everything, to have
Yeah.
everything in the work or nothing.
What number is that, Marty?
it's slide number.
It's on page 5, by page 5. Oh, you don't have to.
It's slide number. Slide number 28. Thank you.
Yeah, that's impressive.
Well, the page. Okay. So it says when, as if free from care on account of its wealth, it thinks it is the right order of things for it to get everything and the worker nothing. I mean, I think that is a concept that is raging in this country right now. And I think that it to the point where it becomes a kind of correctness, rightness, that isn't right at all. But somehow it's out there as if it's right. So like you're doing something right if you have become wealthy. Like that's kind of in our culture where it starts. Conversely, you're doing something wrong if you're poor. Which only, and of course, that's an idea that only held by the wealthy, but that is this tendency to enshrine certain things as if they are right, when actually they're not right at all. They're just a great defense.
So the comment is, again, pointing out that slide, how the tendency is to make things that are not right appear perfectly normal and part of just what should be, where actually what's hidden behind that is actually forms of discrimination or amoral type of behavior. If we
You said that much better.
So if we go back to 1931, at that time, I think it's important to realize that battles were still raging over what was the appropriate share of profits that should go to the owner of the business versus the worker of the business. Remember, when the Industrial Revolution happened, right, you were coming out of a situation where those who produced the goods were primarily artisans, right? This was before factories were, and artisans got the full share of the profits in manufacturing, right? Chairs, tables, whatever it might be. What happened, and this was viewed as right and proper and part of really God's ordained law. When you started to get factories in the Industrial Revolution, that started to switch, because then people with money could set up the factories, employ the workers at a lower wage, and the battles raged around that, right? Well, if you're working, why are you only getting a tenth of the profits as opposed to 80% of the profits, right? Why weren't the salaries higher? That battle, I think you're right, you no longer talk in those terms, but it's inherently still there, right? In the kind of battle over living wage, right? At the least, right? If you're working, you should own a living wage. And on the other side, it's no, if you do that, right, then you're going to throw a bunch of businesses out of work, right? They'll no longer be there. So that battle rage is there. I think you're absolutely correct, right? That in any kind of situation where you have these foundational debates, you are going to have one side that tries to portray what they're doing as normal, right? And the other side is what they are advocating for as abnormal. So you're absolutely correct. And this there, right, in 1931, at least the Catholic Church, and I would say quite a few, right, other religious authorities, remember this is when the social gospel started to come up, right? They really were more on the side of the workers, and the workers should be getting a larger share of the profits, and they were on the side, right, of the business owners. That's completely flipped these days in terms of public opinion. So that's I think, a very astute comment. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, we have a check. All right, the question is, I have a question regarding intersectionality. Does a theory claim to be global in its value and representation, or is it limited to a US-centric culture? On the one hand, it claims to care about people such as immigrants, but in my experience as a gay Arab immigrant, if you happen to hold distinctly Arab values, your intersectionality is not just questioned, but often invalidated and chastised. So I sometimes find myself doubting and wondering about the theory and its internal consistencies. Thank you so much for that question. The theory itself of intersectionality is global. As a matter of fact, if you go on the web and you look for definitions of intersectionality, you will find them primarily to be in the academic sphere, right? That kind of crosses borders in many different ways. But social movements have applied this theory of intersectionality to their activism. And there's activism occurs all over the world, right, around these quote unquote social justice issues. So if you look at, for example, where activists gather globally, it's in what are called the World Social Forum. This started back in, don't quote me on this, probably about 1980 in Brazil, in Porto Alegre. And yearly and then regionally, activists on just about every single issue you can imagine will gather. And intersectionality has entered, right, the discourse of activists around the world in terms of its usefulness for analysis and its application to what they're trying to do. So excellent question. It's not just, it was coined in the United States, but then like ideas, many and perhaps most ideas rapidly caught fire in many different places. The big question is how large is the activist community in any one particular country, especially in countries where it's much more difficult to be an activist around these issues. Other questions or comments? Yes.
On your slide that talked about the different types of justice, and distributive justice, and procedural justice, and first two, the 10 people. What I've heard from activists is that the restorative justice is being underemphasized by the white majority in terms of how do we provide equity racially. And I noticed that the arguments about the fear of wealth redistribution, all you want to do is take the wealth that each of all the rest made and develop their lives and give it to those who haven't been able to make it. But without what the poor people's campaign is talking about, you have to have before reparation or before restoration. You have to repair the rich, need reparations, And then reconciliation, restorative justice.
Yeah, great, thank you. So the question is, in terms of different types of justice, social justice has concentrated mostly on the first two that were listed, which was distributive and procedural. But in the African American community, according to the experience, restorative justice is also something that's key and it tends to be underemphasized or seen as underemphasized by that community. I would say you're absolutely right? And you are seeing, obviously, with the question of reparations, and you're also seeing this also as far as people are incarcerated, right? Things along those lines. So I would say that that is growing, and I think it's a great thing that it's growing, right? We need more attention, and particularly, those of us who are Christian, where there are going to be a lot of differences over reparations, what reparations means. But if we focus just on the prison aspect of things, right? I mean, that is an emphasis of Jesus himself, right? In terms of visiting those in prison, in terms of paying attention to people in prison. And I think Katie spoke so eloquently today in her sermon, right, about one aspect of it.
And I would just add that your concept or biblical concept of Jubilee is tied very closely into reparations.
Well, and yes, so thank you. So if we go then to Jubilee and reparations, I would actually go one further, which kind of ties it back with the previous comment, that I believe the Bible not only talks about Jubilee as quote unquote redistribution, because the first distribution made it clear the land was God's land, right? And yes, it was assigned to particular people, but it was assigned for a particular purpose and was redistributed once it began to be concentrated or too concentrated in hands every 50 years. The other thing also I think it's important for us as Christians to realize is the Bible speaks very strongly against profit and maximizing profit completely. If you're familiar with the concept of gleaning and the importance of gleaning in Scripture, where when you harvested your field, you left some for the poor, I think that speaks very clearly, right? To be very cautious if you are going into and you're trying to maximize your profit completely and not pay attention to some of the ways that socially, right, you can be have in your mind what's going on with your profit making. That might be a little bit of a complicated issue, but I think it also speaks right to that mentality that sometimes we just assume, oh yeah, kind of maximizing profit is something that's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with profit. The Bible, I think, clearly says that businesses are incredibly important, that making profit is absolutely fine. Maximizing profit in terms of the consequences that it has, I think the Scripture is pretty clear that you're going down the wrong road there. Yes.
On that same line, if you have an actual corporation, just a regular one in the US, you have a contractual obligation that if you don't fulfill, you can be sued for to maximize shareholder value. Okay? There is a new type of corporation that exists called a B corporation. So, I mean, to me, this is a glimmer of hope, where instead of just maximizing shareholder value, you have to maximize value of the stakeholders, which includes the employee and the community in which you operate. And on a parallel track, there is a company, it's actually just down the road here, called B Corp. It's in Berlin, that goes around and they evaluate on a worldwide basis companies and give them a sort of a special kudos, if you will. It's not a legal thing, but they advertise, but that essentially says the same thing. These companies are actually helping their communities, their employees, etc. Anyone who actually stakes in the company, not just the owners. And I forget at this point, a few years ago when I was looking at this, there were hundreds of companies worldwide.
It's in the thousands now.
It's in the thousands, yeah, I bet it is now.
So a comment about following up on the business side of things, and there are things called B corporations that have sprung up because of the difficulties presented by law that if you incorporate as a corporation, you have to put your shareholders first. So yeah, appreciate that. And that is, I think along with that, that's not the only manifestation in the business sector of things where businesses and capitalism itself now is taking into account what is called several different bottom lines, the environment, for example, right? The community of workers. So you're seeing many different movements that I think, again, coming back to Katie's sermon, right, that are very hopeful. And I think it speaks to kind of what we're talking about as a whole, the social justice and intersectionality. Those who are struggling for justice generally have had a very negative view of business, right? And have been kind of at loggerheads with business. With all of these new movements coming up, corporate social responsibility, no matter what you want to say, may just be a fig leaf, but I do know people in corporations that take it very seriously and are very committed to it. You have the fair trade movement, you have the B corporations, you have CEOs, right, pledging their companies to do better by both their workers and their communities. And that's not to say anything is perfect, but it does open up the chance, and you see more of this, for activists along racial lines, along gender lines, along kind of wealth lines of coordinating with business to bring about better outcomes. So there is a lot going on there. And I think, unfortunately, in the church sometimes, you still have the attitude of, oh, so-and-so was a business person until they accepted a higher call of pastor, whatever. That is just so non-scriptural, right? I mean, business is a calling in and of itself. It's pleasing to God. I think God takes just great pleasure in kind of the art of the closing the deal, right? As long as this is run as a witness and a testimony to Christ in terms of how you're going about it. And so to see business as a calling and to revel in that, I think our churches should be fully supporting that, and obviously supporting kind of the integration of businesses with activists, you know, to bring about what God wants to see, which is kind of the kingdom being fulfilled in all of its dimensions. Again, I kind of get excited about this stuff. I don't know what time it is, but I see some hands, but let's go. Okay.
Hey, one more that I just want to comment. Does not quite address the systematic racism and oppression that is our laws and our practices. In order to come playing field for everyone, we need to change their story. Practice our fair housing law, our justice system. It needs it on a global level.
But and the comment is that intersectionality doesn't really seem to address the embedded racism and not necessarily offer solutions to that. And I think that's why it's important that we take critical race theory, intersectionality, and social justice together, right? Because as we saw, you're going to have differences of opinion about what's out there, but some of these, like intersectionality, is more of a theory that people then take and try to apply in conjunction with some of the other things that we talked about. So thanks for that. I think that's a very good insight.
Thank you all for
Thank you.
coming. If you did not get this week's or last week's slides, there's still a couple of copies here in the front. If you did not sign our little attendance sheet, would you kindly do so? Thanks so much for coming. Come this afternoon to the Black History Month celebration, and we look forward to seeing you all at the book club. Thank you.